He took a wrong turn down a Pennsylvania backroad, and his life changed forever. He was always just an ordinary Hollywood legend. At 93, Clint Eastwood thought he'd seen it all, done it all. His days passed by quietly. Nothing hinted at trouble. But one day something happened that turned everything upside down. At first it seemed like a coincidence, just a troubled horse rearing up against the morning sky, and a young Amish man desperately clinging to the reins. But then, things started to get even stranger. Seconds felt like an eternity. His heart was pounding. And then at that very moment, when it seemed like the horse would throw its handler into the fence posts, Clint found himself vaulting over the paddock fence with an agility that belied his years. But the most unbelievable part happened after that. It was so incredible that if someone had told him before, he never would have believed it. That this single moment would lead him to spend months with an Amish family, helping them heal not just a troubled horse but the deep wounds of grief that had torn them apart. And in doing so, he would find his own peace in the most unlikely of places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crisp autumn air carried whispers of change across Lancaster County's rolling farmland, where fate was about to intertwine the lives of two unlikely souls. Through the morning mist, an aging Hollywood legend found himself drawn to a scene that would alter not just his life, but the fabric of an entire Amish family's existence. What brought Clint Eastwood to this peaceful countryside? Perhaps it was divine intervention, or maybe just the restless wandering of a man seeking solace from his own demons. The thundering of hooves broke the pastoral silence as Clint's rental car rounded the bend of a narrow country road. Through the windshield, he witnessed a young Amish man desperately clinging to the reins of a massive black horse, its powerful form rearing against the morning sky. The animal's wild eyes reflected a pain that Clint recognized all too well, the kind that comes from loss and confusion. Levi Zook's arms burned as he fought to control Justice, his brother Aaron's beloved horse. Since Aaron's death, the once gentle creature had become increasingly unpredictable, as if sharing in the family's unspoken grief. Today's episode had started with a simple morning exercise, but Justice's panic had escalated quickly, threatening to throw Levi into the wooden fence posts that lined their property. From his vantage point, Clint noticed the subtle signs of fear in both horse and handler, the way Justice's ears pinned back, the slight tremor in the young man's hands. Having worked with countless horses throughout his film career, Clint recognized the dangerous dance unfolding before him. Without hesitation, he pulled his car to the side of the road and stepped out, his weathered boots crunching against the gravel. Mary Zook watched anxiously from the farmhouse porch, her heart racing as she witnessed the struggle between her surviving son and the horse that had once been so gentle under Aaron's touch. Her hands clutched her apron, prayers moving silently across her lips as she noticed the stranger approaching the fence. Something in his deliberate movement and calm demeanor sparked a glimmer of hope in her heart. Eli Zook emerged from the barn, his stern face masking the fear that gripped him at the sight of his son in danger. The memory of losing Aaron was still too fresh, too raw. His instinct was to rush forward, but something held him back. Perhaps the same invisible force that had kept him emotionally distant from Levi since Aaron's passing. Justice's hooves pounded against the earth, sending tremors through the ground as Clint carefully approached the fence. His presence caught Levi's attention, causing him to momentarily lose focus on the reins. The horse seized this opportunity, jerking violently to the left and nearly unseating his young handler. Without thinking, Clint vaulted over the fence, with an agility that belied his years. "Easy now," Clint's voice carried across the paddock, low and steady. The familiar tone of authority caught Justice's attention, his ears flicking forward in curiosity. Levi, startled by the stranger's intervention, found himself responding to the calm command as well. Who was this elderly Englishman who moved with such confidence toward a dangerous situation? The tension in the air shifted as Clint slowly approached, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. Years of experience had taught him that moments like these required a delicate balance of authority and gentleness. He could see the same wild fear in Justice's eyes that he'd witnessed in countless horses on film sets. a fear born of confusion and loss of trust. Mary descended the porch steps, drawn to the unfolding scene. She noticed how the stranger's presence seemed to affect not just the horse but her son as well. Levi's grip on the reins had steadied, his breathing becoming more controlled as he followed the older man's lead. Even Eli, typically dismissive of outside interference, remained silent as he watched the scene unfold. Justice's movements began to settle, his powerful muscles still trembling, but his stance less aggressive. Clint continued his approach, speaking, in low tones that carried years of experience and understanding. What none of them realized in that moment was how this chance encounter would become the catalyst for healing wounds that ran far deeper than the morning's drama, wounds that had threatened to tear apart the very foundation of the Zook family. The horse's nervous dancing slowed to an uncertain shuffle, his dark eyes fixed on Clint. In this moment of relative calm, the air seemed charged with possibility. Who was this mysterious English man who appeared just when needed? How would his presence affect the delicate balance of their Amish life? And could he possibly understand the complex web of grief, duty, and unspoken words that had brought them all to this precise moment in time? Golden wheat fields stretched endlessly across Lancaster County, as Clint Eastwood's car wound through the narrow country roads. At 93, he'd seen his share of beautiful places, but something about this landscape stirred memories of simpler times. Times before Hollywood, before the fame, when the world still held mystery. The sight of an Amish buggy ahead caused him to ease off the accelerator. As he passed, the young boy holding the reins caught his attention, reminding him of the troubled youth he'd witnessed struggling with that spirited horse just days before. The image of Levi Zook fighting to control justice had stayed with him, haunting his thoughts with its raw desperation. Through the morning mist, Clint spotted the Zook family farm, its weathered buildings standing testament to generations of hard work and tradition. Mary Zook was already outside, her dark dress and white bonnet stark against the morning sky as she gathered eggs. She paused, watching his approach with quiet curiosity, rather than the suspicion he'd expected. "You must be the Englisher everyone's been talking about," Mary said, her voice carrying a gentle warmth that belied the formal greeting. The news of his presence had clearly traveled fast through the tight-knit community, though how much they knew about his identity remained unclear. Before Clint could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Eli Zook emerged from the barn, his stern countenance a sharp contrast to his wife's welcoming demeanor. The man's weathered face carried the weight of loss, a burden Clint recognized all too well from his own reflection. "What brings a man like you to our farm?" Eli's question carried an edge of protective authority, his eyes darting between Clint and the barn where Levi worked with justice. The tension in his shoulders spoke of a father's worry, perhaps fear of another loss. Mary stepped forward, her presence somehow softening the air between the two men. "Perhaps God sends help in unexpected ways, Eli." Her words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, hinting at deeper understanding of their family's struggles. Inside the barn, the sound of Justice's nervous shuffling echoed against wooden walls. Clint could hear Levi's low voice attempting to soothe the agitated horse, but the strain in his tone revealed the ongoing challenge. The parallel between the horse's unrest and the family's emotional state wasn't lost on him. "I saw your son with that horse the other day," Clint said, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes an outside perspective can help when we're too close to see clearly. His gaze met Eli's, a silent understanding passing between them, both men familiar with the burden of expectations and the price of pride. Mary's quiet observation of their exchange revealed her own wisdom. She recognized something in Clint that perhaps even he didn't fully understand yet, a purpose that had brought him to their farm beyond mere chance or curiosity. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the barn doors. Justice's anxious nickering continued, a reminder of the work ahead. But it was more than just a horse that needed healing in this place. The ghost of Aaron Zook seemed to hover in every corner, in every strained silence between father and son, in every worried glance Mary cast toward the barn. Could an aging Hollywood legend find common ground with an Amish family bound by tradition and grief? What wisdom could bridge the vast gulf between their worlds? As Clint stood there feeling the weight of Eli's scrutiny and Mary's hope, he realized that perhaps his own journey of healing was inexplicably tied to theirs. The sound of something crashing inside the barn suddenly broke the tension. Levi's voice rose in frustration, followed by Justice's frightened whinny. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected. Would Eli's pride allow an outsider to help? Could Clint's experience with horses provide the key to unlocking more than just Justice's trust? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lancaster County's patchwork fields as Clint Eastwood's rental car crawled along the narrow country road. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel while his eyes scanned the pastoral landscape, so different from the California terrain he'd left behind. The rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves and the occasional rattle of buggy wheels had become familiar companions during his short time here. A commotion in a distant field caught his attention. A young man wrestling with a spirited black horse that reared and pulled against its lead rope. The animal's distressed neighs carried across the open space, prompting Clint to ease his foot off the accelerator. Something about the scene stirred memories of his countless Western films, where he'd worked with troubled horses and troubled souls alike. The young man, clearly Amish from his traditional clothing and broad-brimmed hat, struggled to maintain his footing as the horse circled anxiously. Clint recognized the telltale signs of a horse carrying deep emotional wounds, mirroring the tension in the young handler's movements. What had caused such distrust between man and beast? Without conscious thought, Clint found himself pulling onto the grassy shoulder. His joints protested as he emerged from the car, but decades of horsemanship drew him toward the unfolding drama. The young man hadn't noticed his approach, too focused on preventing the horse from breaking free. Up close, Clint could see the sheen of sweat on both their bodies, evidence of a lengthy battle of wills. "Easy now," Clint called out, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded movie sets for decades. The young man startled, losing his grip on the lead rope. The horse, a magnificent Morgan with eyes wild with fear, seized the opportunity to bolt several yards away, though something kept it from fleeing entirely. Perhaps some remnant of trust or training still lingered beneath its panic. "I'm sorry, English," the young man said, using the Amish term for outsiders. "This isn't a safe place for you." Clint noticed the slight tremor in his voice, the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. This was Levi Zook, he realized, remembering Mary's description of her younger son. "Horses have been my business longer than you've been alive," Clint replied, maintaining a careful distance from both, man and beast. "That one's carrying more than just physical burdens." The statement caused Levi to pause, his eyes darting between Clint and the horse with newfound uncertainty. The horse, Justice, if Mary's account was accurate, pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring as it assessed the newcomer. Clint recognized the complex layers of emotion in its behavior. Fear mingled with longing, trust warring with betrayal. How many times had he seen similar conflicts in human eyes throughout his career? "He was my brother's," Levi said softly, the words carrying across the space between them. "Aaron's. Since then." He trailed off, but the unspoken grief hung heavy in the air. Justice's erratic behavior suddenly made perfect sense. Animals often absorbed and reflected their handlers' emotional states. This horse wasn't just dealing with the loss of its master, it was carrying the weight of an entire family's unresolved sorrow. Clint took a slow step forward, letting Justice track his movement. "Sometimes the hardest trails to ride are the ones that lead through loss," he said, drawing on his own experiences with grief. "But you don't have to walk them alone." The words seemed to resonate with both horse and handler, creating a moment of stillness in the charged atmosphere. What neither man realized was that they were being observed. From the farmhouse window, Mary Zook watched the scene unfold, her quiet wisdom recognizing the hand of Providence in this unexpected encounter. And at the edge of the field, Eli Zook paused in his work, his stern expression masking the complex emotions stirred by the sight of his younger son with this famous English stranger. Would this chance meeting become the catalyst for healing that the Zook family so desperately needed? Could an aging Hollywood legend help bridge the chasm of grief that had divided father and son? And what role would justice play in their journey toward understanding and acceptance? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field as Clint observed the young Amish man's increasingly desperate struggle with the agitated horse. Years of experience with difficult horses on movie sets and his own ranch had taught him to recognize the telltale signs of an animal about to lose control. Justice's flattened ears and wild eyes spoke volumes about the dangerous situation unfolding. Without hesitation, Clint made his way across the field, his movements deliberately slow and steady. The horse's distress reminded him of a particularly challenging stallion he'd worked with on Unforgiven. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't about strength but patience. As he drew closer, he could hear Levi's frustrated murmurs in Pennsylvania Dutch, the foreign words carrying the universal tone of someone at their wits' end. "Easy there, son," Clint called out, his gravelly voice carrying across the distance. "Let me give you a hand with him." The young man's head snapped up, surprise evident in his features as he noticed the legendary actor approaching. Justice took advantage of the distraction, rearing up suddenly and nearly yanking the lead rope from Levi's grasp. Clint moved with the surprising agility of someone who'd spent a lifetime around horses, positioning himself at an angle that would block Justice's attempt to bolt while maintaining a non-threatening presence. "The trick is to let him know you're not afraid, but you're not a threat either," he explained, keeping his voice low and steady. "Horses can sense fear just as easily as anger." Levi's initial shock at seeing Clint Eastwood in his family's field gave way to desperate gratitude as Justice began to respond to the older man's calm energy. The horse's breathing slowly steadied, though his muscles remained tense with nervous energy. "He hasn't been the same since—" Levi's voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken grief. The pause in Levi's words told Clint more than any explanation could have. He'd seen that same look of loss in his own mirror too many times not to recognize it. "Sometimes horses carry our grief for us," he said quietly, reaching out to gentle Justice's neck with experienced hands. "They're mirrors of what we can't say ourselves." Mary Zook watched from the farmhouse window as the unlikely pair worked with Justice in the fading daylight. Her heart ached with recognition of how much Levi's stance resembled Aaron's. Yet something about the presence of the elderly actor seemed to ease the constant tension that had plagued their family since her eldest son's death. Perhaps God worked in mysterious ways indeed. In the field, Clint demonstrated a technique for Levi to help calm Justice during his anxious moments. The horse's responses became increasingly positive as they worked together, creating a rhythm that spoke of potential healing for both animal and handler. "Your brother trained him before?" Clint asked, though he already suspected the answer. Levi nodded, his usual reticence falling away in the face of shared understanding. "Aaron had a way with horses that seemed like magic. Justice was his pride and joy." The words caught in his throat, but Clint's steady presence made it easier to continue. "After the accident, Justice wouldn't let anyone near him for weeks. Father wanted to sell him, but Mother insisted we keep trying." The mention of Eli Zook drew Clint's attention to a distant figure by the barn, Levi's father, watching their interaction with an unreadable expression. The complexity of family expectations and grief hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the approaching evening mist. Yet something about this moment, this connection between three wounded souls, man, youth, and horse, held the promise of transformation. As Justice finally allowed Levi to lead him in a calm circle, Clint recognized the familiar stirring of purpose that had drawn him to storytelling throughout his career. Here was a story unfolding before him, one of loss and healing, of bridges built between seemingly insurmountable gaps. The question was, what role would he play in its telling? The dust settled around Justice's hooves as the horse's breathing steadied under Clint's experienced touch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barnyard, where Levi stood transfixed by the legendary actor's natural way with the troubled animal. Before either could speak, the distinct sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the barn entrance. Eli Zook's imposing figure filled the doorway, his stern expression hardening at the sight of the stranger in his barn. Years of grief had etched deep lines around his eyes, making him appear older than his 45 years. His gaze shifted between his son and Clint, calculating the situation with the precision of a man accustomed to protecting his family from the influences of the English world. "What brings an outsider to our barn?" Eli's voice carried the weight of authority, though a subtle tremor betrayed his unease at finding this unexpected visitor so close to justice. Aaron's horse. Clint maintained his calm demeanor, his weathered hands still resting on Justice's neck. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion. I was passing by when I noticed your son having some trouble with this fine horse here." His voice, carrying decades of gravitas, seemed to fill the barn with a quiet authority of its own. The tension mounted as Eli stepped further into the barn, his eyes fixed on the way Justice remained unusually settled under the stranger's touch. The horse that had been nearly unmanageable since Aaron's death now stood quietly, ears forward, almost peaceful. This visible change in Justice's demeanor seemed to catch Eli off guard, creating a crack in his defensive stance. Mary's arrival broke the mounting tension as she appeared behind her husband, her quiet presence bringing a shift to the atmosphere. Her intuitive understanding of delicate situations had saved many family conflicts from escalating over the years. "I heard voices," she said, her gentle tone carrying an unspoken invitation for civility. "This is Mr. Eastwood," Levi offered, finding his voice. "He helped when Justice was about to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would remind them all of how close they'd come to losing another family member to the horse's unpredictable behavior. Mary's eyes met Clint's, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps of the healing potential this moment might hold. "Then we owe you our thanks," she said, moving past Eli to stand closer to their visitor. "Would you join us for evening meal?" Eli's sharp intake of breath at his wife's invitation didn't go unnoticed, but Mary continued, "It's the least we can offer for your help with Justice." Her use of the horse's name, Aaron's horse, carried significant weight in the barn's heavy air. Clint recognized the complexity of the situation, reading the family dynamics with the insight of someone who had portrayed countless complex characters throughout his career. The father's protective resistance, the mother's intuitive outreach, and the son caught between duty and desire for change. It was a story he'd seen before, though never quite like this. "I wouldn't want to impose," Clint responded carefully, understanding that his presence represented more than just an unexpected visitor. It was a potential disruption to their carefully ordered world. "You wouldn't be," Mary assured, while Eli remained silent, his internal struggle visible in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The decision to welcome an outsider, especially one who had managed to do what none of them could with Justice, challenged everything he'd built to protect his family since Aaron's death. Levi watched this exchange with growing hope, seeing in this moment a possible bridge between the world he knew and the one he secretly yearned to understand better. The way Clint handled both Justice and the delicate family dynamics sparked something in him, a recognition of what it meant to lead with quiet strength rather than rigid authority. The barn fell silent, except for Justice's soft nickering, as if the horse too was waiting to see how this pivotal moment would unfold. Would Eli's protective walls prove too high to scale? Could Mary's gentle wisdom create an opening for change? And what role would Clint Eastwood, this unexpected catalyst, play in the unfolding story of the Zook family's healing? The aroma of Mary's freshly baked bread filled the modest Zook farmhouse as the unlikely dinner party settled around the worn oak table. Clint Eastwood, who had dined with presidents and Hollywood royalty, found himself oddly moved by the simple dignity of the scene before him, the plain white walls, the absence of electricity, and the genuine hospitality that transcended cultural barriers. Mary's quiet efficiency in serving the meal provided a stark contrast to the palpable tension emanating from Eli, who sat rigid in his chair, stealing glances at their famous guest between mumbled prayers. Levi's shoulders remained hunched, his eyes fixed on the steaming bowl of potato soup before him, as if it might provide an escape from the suffocating atmosphere. The bread recipe has been in our family for generations, Mary offered softly, breaking the silence as she passed the warm loaf. Her gentle words seemed to float above the undercurrent of unspoken grief that hung heavy in the air. Clint noticed how she touched Eli's shoulder as she moved past him, a gesture so subtle yet laden with meaning. The clink of spoons against bowls punctuated the silence until Clint spoke, his gravelly voice carrying decades of experience in navigating difficult conversations. I appreciate your hospitality. Your farm reminds me of my grandfather's place in Nebraska. Simpler times. He watched as Eli's jaw tightened, clearly wrestling with the propriety of having a Hollywood icon at his table. We maintain our ways for good reason, Mr. Eastwood, Eli responded, his words carrying an edge of defensive pride. The English world holds little appeal for those who seek to live purely. The word English carried weight, drawing a clear line between their worlds. Levi's spoon clattered against his bowl, drawing all eyes to him momentarily. The young man's struggle was evident, caught between respect for his father's ways and something else, something that seemed to burn behind his eyes. It was a look Clint had seen countless times in his films, the expression of a soul yearning for something just out of reach. Mary smoothly intervened. Levi tells me you've shown interest in justice, Mr. Eastwood. Her words carried deliberate weight, knowing the horse's significance to their family. The mention of Justice's name caused a subtle shift in the room's energy. Eli's shoulders stiffened further while Levi finally lifted his gaze from his bowl. Fine animal, Clint replied carefully, noting the complex emotions playing across their faces. Reminds me of a horse I worked with years ago. Spirited, but hurting. Sometimes they just need someone to understand their pain. The parallel to the family's own suffering hung unspoken in the air. Eli's hand tightened around his spoon. Justice was Aaron's horse, he stated flatly, the name of his deceased son falling like a stone into still water. He understood that animal better than anyone. The words carried an unintended rebuke toward Levi, who seemed to shrink further into himself. Mary's eyes flickered with concern as she watched her younger son struggle with the weight of his father's words. The comparison to Aaron, always the comparison, lay heavy in the air between father and surviving son. Clint observed the dynamic with the keen eye of a storyteller, recognizing the familiar threads of family tragedy he'd explored in his own films. Different writers, different connections, Clint offered carefully, his words directed more at Levi than Eli. Each relationship has its own rhythm, its own truth. He watched as Levi's eyes met his briefly, a flash of gratitude crossing the young man's face. The conversation ebbed and flowed like a cautious tide, touching on safe subjects, the weather, the crops, the changing seasons. Yet beneath the surface, pleasantries' deeper currents stirred. Every mention of the farm's future caused Eli's expression to harden. Every reference to tradition made Levi's shoulders tense. Mary continued her quiet orchestration of the meal, her gentle presence a balm on the raw edges of family wounds. As the meal drew to a close, the lingering daylight casting long shadows through the windows, Clint found himself struck by the parallels between this family's struggle and the countless stories of human connection he'd brought to the screen. Here, in this simple farmhouse far from the glitter of Hollywood, another story was unfolding, one of loss, love, and the complex bonds between fathers and sons. What would it take to bridge the chasm between Eli and Levi? How could a family heal when the very traditions meant to unite them seemed to be pulling them apart? As Mary began clearing the dishes, these questions hung in the air, awaiting answers that would unfold in their own time, in their own way. The morning dew still clung to the vegetables as Mary Zook moved methodically through her garden, her practiced, hand-selecting ripe tomatoes and pulling persistent weeds. The rhythmic sound of hooves on packed earth drew her attention to Clint Eastwood approaching on foot, his weathered face contemplative in the early light. Mrs. Zook, he acknowledged with a slight nod, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of age and experience. Mary straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as she observed the man who had brought such an unexpected presence into their ordered world. The tomatoes are coming in strong this year, Mary offered, her gentle voice carrying years of unspoken wisdom. Would you care to help me gather some? The simple invitation carried deeper meaning, an opportunity for the conversation they both knew needed to happen. Clint knelt carefully beside her, his movements betraying the protests of aging joints. His large, calloused hands looked almost comical handling the delicate fruit, but there was a surprising gentleness in his touch. "Your son, Levi," he began. "There's something weighing on him. Something more than just typical young man's restlessness." Mary's hands stilled momentarily over a tomato plant. "You see much, Mr. Eastwood," she said softly. "Perhaps that's why God brought you to our door." She moved to the next plant, maintaining the steady rhythm of harvest while choosing her words carefully. "We had another son, Aaron. He was our firstborn." The weight of the past tense hung heavy in the morning air. Clint remained silent, offering Mary the space to continue her story at her own pace. His presence, solid and patient, encouraged her to share what had remained largely unspoken within their family for too long. Aaron was everything an Amish father could want in a son, Mary continued, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. Strong, faithful, obedient. He had a special way with horses, especially Justice. That horse would follow him, anywhere, do anything he asked. She paused, examining a tomato with unnecessary attention. 2 years ago there was an accident, a spooked horse, a broken fence, a fall that no one saw coming. Aaron was gone before we could say goodbye. The garden's peaceful atmosphere seemed to absorb the gravity of her words. Clint's hands, still holding a tomato, tightened slightly, as understanding dawned. The family's strained dynamics, Justice's nervous behavior, Eli's rigid expectations for Levi, all pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "Eli hasn't been the same since," Mary admitted. "He holds so tight to our ways, to what's left, afraid of losing more. And Levi," she sighed, her love for both husband and surviving son evident in her voice. "Levi carries not only his own dreams, but the weight of becoming someone he's not, trying to fill Aaron's absence." Clint absorbed this information, understanding now why his presence had caused such ripples in the family's carefully maintained facade of normalcy. "And Justice?" he asked, thinking of the troubled horse that had drawn him into this family story. "Justice was there when it happened," Mary explained. "He hasn't been the same either, like he carries his own kind of grief. Levi tries with him, but—" She left the sentence unfinished, the implications clear. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows through the garden rows. Mary's revelation hung between them, offering context to the complex dynamics Clint had observed. But there was something more in her sharing this story, a hope perhaps that this outsider who had inexplicably entered their lives might help heal wounds that time alone had failed to mend. "Your family carries much," Clint observed quietly, his words careful and measured. "Sometimes it takes an outside eye to see the path forward." He paused, considering his next words. "Levi has a strength in him, different from Aaron's maybe, but no less valuable." Mary's eyes met his, a flash of gratitude crossing her face. "You see him as he is, not as who we wished he would become," she said softly. "Perhaps that's why he's drawn to you." She returned to her harvesting, but her movements seemed lighter, as if sharing the burden of their family's grief had lifted some invisible weight. The morning continued its quiet progression, the simple act of gathering tomatoes transformed into something more profound, a sharing of truth, an acknowledgement of pain, and perhaps the first steps toward healing. But as Mary and Clint worked side by side in the peaceful garden, neither could anticipate how this shared understanding would impact the delicate balance of the Zook family in the days to come. The pre-dawn darkness blanketed the Zook farm as Clint made his way across the dewy grass, his boots leaving dark impressions in their wake. After Mary's revelation about Aaron the previous evening, sleep had proven elusive. The weight of the family's grief felt tangible now, explaining the subtle tensions he'd observed since arriving. Through the dim light he spotted Levi's silhouette moving methodically between the barn stalls, The young man's movements carried a heaviness that seemed at odds with his age, each task performed with mechanical precision, rather than the natural rhythm one might expect from someone raised on a farm. "Mind if I join you?" Clint's voice, gravelly, from lack of sleep, broke the morning silence. Levi startled slightly, nearly dropping the feed bucket he carried. "Mr. Eastwood, you're up early." The surprise in his voice carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if unsure whether to welcome the company or maintain his solitude. "Sleep and I have been arguing for years now," Clint replied, picking up an empty bucket. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." He fell into step beside Levi, matching the younger man's pace as they moved through the morning routine. As they worked, Clint noticed how Levi would pause whenever they passed Justice's stall, his eyes flickering toward the horse before quickly looking away. The animal's presence seemed to create an invisible barrier, one that Levi carefully navigated around rather than through. The morning tasks provided a window into Levi's world, one filled with unspoken obligations and carefully maintained distances. Each time they crossed paths with Eli, who moved through his own chores with stern efficiency, Levi's shoulders would tense slightly, his movements becoming more deliberate, more careful. Mary appeared briefly, bringing out warm coffee for Clint and tea for herself, her quiet presence offering a momentary respite from the morning's heavy atmosphere. Her eyes held understanding as she watched Clint work alongside her son, recognizing, perhaps, that this simple act of shared labor might open doors that words could not. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the barnyard, Clint observed how Levi's movements betrayed a deeper struggle. The young man approached each task with determination, but seemed to lack the peace that should come from such familiar work. His actions spoke of duty rather than purpose, of obligation rather than choice. "You've got a good system here," Clint commented, helping to stack fresh hay bales. "But sometimes the most familiar paths can become the hardest to walk." Levi paused, his hand still gripping the twine of a hay bale. "What do you mean?" "When we do something because we think we must, rather than because we choose to, even the simplest tasks can feel like carrying stones." Clint kept his tone casual, continuing to work as he spoke. "I've spent enough years in this world to know that the weight of expectations can be heavier than any load we physically carry." The morning light now filtered through the barn's high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between them. Levi's silence spoke volumes, his internal struggle visible in the way he methodically completed each task, while clearly wrestling with thoughts he couldn't or wouldn't express. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their work brought them eventually to Justice's stall, where the horse watched them with wary eyes. The animal's nervous energy seemed to mirror Levi's own internal state, both of them caught in patterns they couldn't quite break free from. "You know," Clint said, keeping his distance from the stall, "sometimes the hardest part of moving forward isn't the path ahead. It's the shadows we're afraid to leave behind." The morning chores continued, but something had shifted in the air between them. Questions hung unspoken. How does one honor the past while building a future? What happens when duty and desire pull in opposite directions? And perhaps most importantly, how does a young man find his own path while carrying the weight of others' expectations? As the morning progressed, Clint realized that these simple farm tasks were more than just chores. They were a daily ritual that both grounded and confined Levi, a routine that offered security but perhaps also served as chains. The question remained, would this morning's shared work begin to forge a bridge between what was and what could be? The early morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Clint and Levi finished the last of their chores. Justice stomped restlessly in his stall, his hooves echoing against the wooden floors, a constant reminder of the weight both men carried in their hearts. The aging actor watched as Levi methodically cleaned the horse's stall, noting how the young man's movements seemed mechanical, driven by duty rather than passion. "You know, I once had a role I turned down that haunted me for years," Clint offered unexpectedly, his gravelly voice breaking the morning silence. "Dirty Harry wasn't my first choice. I was worried about being typecast, afraid of what people would expect from me. He paused, studying Levi's reaction. Sometimes the expectations we fear most become the very things that define us. Levi's hand stilled on the pitchfork. Did Aaron tell you about his dreams? He asked quietly, avoiding Clint's gaze. He wanted to train horses professionally. Father said it wasn't our way. The young man's voice carried years of unspoken tension, mirroring his brother's unfulfilled aspirations. The conversation shifted as Justice whinnied softly, drawing both men's attention. Clint approached the stall carefully, his weathered hand extending toward the nervous animal. Your brother's horse reminds me of a stallion I worked with on Unforgiven. Unpredictable, full of fire. But there was something special there, something worth taking the time to understand. Their shared moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mary Zook appeared in the barn doorway, her quiet presence carrying an air of gentle wisdom. She watched silently as Clint continued to speak with her son, recognizing the subtle shift in Levi's demeanor, a softening around his eyes that she hadn't seen since Aaron's passing. Your mother tells me you have a way with the younger horses, Clint mentioned, carefully steering the conversation toward Levi's own talents. That's not something you can teach. It's a gift. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, beyond their simple truth. Levi's response came slowly, weighted with years of comparing himself to his brother's memory. Aaron was better with them. He understood them in a way I never could. The young man's admission carried the burden of living in a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. Clint moved closer to Justice's stall, his eyes fixed on the horse's nervous movements. You know what I've learned after 90 years? We spend too much time trying to be someone else's version of ourselves. The actor's words carried the weight of decades of experience. Your brother had his path, but that doesn't mean yours has to look the same. As the morning progressed, their conversation deepened, touching on themes of duty, dreams, and the complex nature of family expectations. Mary occasionally contributed quiet observations, her presence acting as a bridge between the old and new, tradition and change. Through their shared stories, a subtle transformation began to take shape, not just in Levi, but in Clint as well. The aging actor found himself opening up about his own struggles with aging, with letting go of control, and with accepting that life rarely follows the script we write for it. His vulnerability created a space for Levi to voice his own fears and doubts, particularly about living up to his father's expectations while honoring his brother's memory. Justice's occasional interruptions served as poignant punctuation marks to their conversation, his restless energy a physical manifestation of the unresolved emotions swirling through the barn. Each time the horse acted up, both men instinctively moved to calm him, their shared focus on the animal creating moments of unspoken understanding. As the morning wore on, Mary quietly excused herself, leaving the two men to continue their conversation. The weight of their shared stories hung in the air, creating an invisible bond that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Through their exchange, both began to recognize that sometimes the most profound connections come from acknowledging our vulnerabilities rather than hiding them. What neither man fully realized in that moment was how their morning of shared stories would become a turning point, not just in their relationship with each other, but in their understanding of themselves. The question remained, could these moments of connection help heal the deeper wounds that both men carried? And how would their growing bond affect the delicate balance of the Zook family dynamics? Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Clint watched Levi lead Justice through another training session. The horse's movements had become more fluid over the past weeks, though tension still rippled through his muscles at unexpected sounds. Like his young handler, Justice seemed caught between what he was and what others expected him to be. Thunder rumbled in the distance, causing Justice to stamp nervously. Levi's attempts to soothe the horse reminded Clint of his own son Kyle, and how they'd weathered storms together on their ranch decades ago. The memory brought a familiar ache. Would he ever stop finding echoes of his regrets in everyday moments? Mary Zook appeared at the barn entrance, her quiet presence drawing both men's attention. The storm's coming fast. Best get Justice settled before it hits. Her words carried more than weather wisdom. She'd noticed the brewing tension between Levi and Eli over the past days, their own storm threatening to break. As they led Justice into his stall, Eli entered the barn, his face as dark as the gathering. Clouds. The air grew thick with unspoken words as father and son moved in careful orbits around each other. Clint recognized the dance. He'd performed it himself with Kyle before time, and distance made reconciliation impossible. The first heavy drops of rain hit the barn roof as Eli spoke. The Peterson farm needs help securing their equipment before the storm. They're expecting us. His words were directed at Levi, but his eyes challenged Clint, marking territory. Before anyone could respond, a crash of thunder sent Justice rearing in his stall, nearly breaking the door. The horse's panic sparked a flurry of activity. Levi rushed to calm Justice while Clint moved to secure the stall door. Their synchronized response spoke of growing trust and understanding, something that clearly unsettled Eli. Mary watched from the shadows, her expression knowing yet concerned. He was never like this with Aaron, Eli muttered, the words escaping before he could catch them. The barn fell silent save for the increasing drumbeat of rain and Justice's nervous shuffling. Levi's hands stilled on Justice's neck. "I'm not Aaron, father." The simple statement carried years of pain and comparison. Clint felt the weight of it, remembering similar words spoken by Kyle. Lightning illuminated the barn interior, casting harsh shadows across Eli's face as he struggled with his response. Mary stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Perhaps some storms are meant to be waited out together," she said softly. The wisdom in her words seemed to deflate some of Eli's resistance. He watched as Clint demonstrated, a technique to Levi for calming nervous horses, something he'd learned decades ago on film sets. The method worked, Justice's breathing steadying under their combined attention. As the storm raged outside, the four of them found themselves sharing the confined space of the barn, forced to confront the emotional weather they'd been avoiding. Mary produced thermoses of hot coffee, a small concession to English ways that no one commented on. The warm drinks in close quarters gradually thawed the initial tension. Clint observed how Eli's eyes kept returning to Levi's capable hands as he tended to Justice. Was the father finally seeing his younger son's unique strengths rather than his differences from Aaron? The actor had witnessed countless scenes of reconciliation in his career, but none felt as raw and real as the subtle shift happening in this humble barn. Thunder continued to shake the building, but Justice remained calm under Levi's touch. The horse's transformation seemed to mirror something deeper changing within the family dynamic. Mary caught Clint's eye and smiled slightly. She'd known all along that sometimes healing required an outside perspective, even if it came in the unexpected form of an aging Hollywood legend. As the storm began to pass, the atmosphere in the barn had shifted. No grand declarations or dramatic confrontations had occurred, but something fundamental had changed. Sometimes, Clint reflected, the most important dialogues happened in the spaces between words, in shared moments of crisis weathered together. The question remained, would this temporary truce survive beyond the storm's passing? Or would old patterns reassert themselves once the immediate danger had passed? The answer lay in choices yet to be made, by a father learning to see his son anew, and a son finding the courage to be himself while honoring his family's traditions. The morning after, the storm broke like a new promise across Lancaster County. The air scrubbed clean and heavy with possibility. Clint arrived at the Zook farm before dawn, his weathered boots crunching across puddle-strewn gravel. He found Levi already in the barn, methodically mucking stalls with the kind of determination that suggested he'd barely slept. Justice stood in his stall, ears pricked forward at Clint's entrance. The horse's coat gleamed in the dim light, but tension still rippled beneath the surface, evident in the way he shifted his weight from hoof to hoof. How much of Aaron's spirit still lived in this animal's troubled heart? "Your father given permission for this?" Clint asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Levi's shoulders tightened at the question. "Ma spoke with him," Levi replied, not looking up from his work. He didn't say no. The words hung between them, heavy with all they left, unsaid about Eli Zook's silent disapproval. Clint moved closer to Justice's stall, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried. First rule of training, we start before the horse does. Everything we do sets the tone. He gestured for Levi to join him. What do you see when you look at him? Levi stepped up beside Clint, studying the horse with young eyes that carried old pain. I see my brother's horse, the one he couldn't control in the end. That's your grief talking. Look again. What does Justice tell you about himself? The question sparked something in Levi's expression, a shift from memory to present moment. He tilted his head, really seeing the horse perhaps for the first time since Aaron's death. His muscles are tight, he's watching us, but not aggressive-like. More worried? Good. Fear drives most bad behavior in horses, and people too, if we're being honest. Justice isn't mean, he's lost. Like someone else I know. Clint let that observation settle as he retrieved a lead rope from a nearby hook. The next hour unfolded in quiet instruction as Clint demonstrated groundwork basics. He showed Levi how to read Justice's body language, how to project calm authority without aggression. The horse responded cautiously at first, then with growing interest as he realized this new approach didn't demand blind submission. Mary appeared partway through their session, carrying a basket of fresh breakfast rolls. She settled on a hay bale to watch, her presence a gentle counterweight to Eli's absence. Her quiet approval seemed to give Levi permission to fully engage with the training, to let go of some of the tension he carried in his shoulders. Your brother was a good horseman, Clint said as they worked, but sometimes the best riders can get trapped by their own expertise. They forget that horses need partners, not just masters. He guided Levi's hands to adjust his grip on the lead rope. Feel that? How he yields when you release pressure instead of pulling. The lesson continued until the sun climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows through the barn's windows. Justice had progressed from wary to attentive, following Levi's cues with increasing trust. But it was the change in Levi himself that proved most striking. The way he stood straighter, moved with more confidence. We'll end here, Clint announced, noting how both horse and young man needed time to process these new dynamics. Same time tomorrow? Levi nodded, running a hand along Justice's neck with newfound understanding. Mr. Eastwood, do you think... He paused, wrestling with words that carried the weight of years. Do you think Aaron would approve of doing things different with his horse? The question caught Clint off guard with its raw honesty. He considered his response carefully, aware of Mary's attentive presence nearby. I think Aaron would want his brother and his horse to find their own way forward. Same as your parents want for you, even if they don't always know how to say it. The words hung in the morning air, carrying echoes of possibilities yet to unfold. As Clint headed back to his truck, he caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the farmhouse window. Eli Zook stood like a shadow behind the glass, bearing witness to changes he perhaps wasn't ready to embrace. But he was watching. And sometimes Clint knew that was how healing began. What would tomorrow's training bring? More importantly, what transformations were already taking root in the hearts of those gathered in that barn? The answers would come in their own time, measured out in the patient rhythm of hoofbeats and healing. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Eli Zook made his way across the pasture, his weathered hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sight before him, his son Levi working with Justice under Clint Eastwood's guidance, made his blood boil. What right did this English outsider have to interfere with their ways? Clint noticed Eli's approach first, recognizing the thunderous expression that had become all too familiar over the past weeks. He'd seen that same look of disapproval in countless fathers' eyes throughout his life, but something about Eli's stern demeanor carried a deeper weight of loss and fear. The horse needs a firm hand, Eli called out, his voice carrying across the field. Not these English tricks. His words cut through the peaceful morning air, causing Justice to stamp nervously. The horse's ears flattened against his head, picking up on the tension radiating from Eli. Levi's shoulders stiffened as he maintained his gentle hold on Justice's lead rope. The progress they'd made with the horse over the past few days seemed to evaporate under his father's harsh gaze. Why couldn't his father see that the old ways of breaking a horse's spirit weren't the answer? "With respect, Mr. Zook," Clint interjected, his gravelly voice calm but firm. "Sometimes the gentlest touch can accomplish what force cannot." He moved slowly, positioning himself between father and son without making it obvious. The gesture wasn't lost on Mary Zook, who watched silently from the kitchen window, her hand stilled in the midst of kneading bread. Eli's face reddened beneath his beard. "You know nothing of our ways, Mr. Eastwood. This is not one of your Hollywood productions where you can simply rewrite the ending." The bitterness in his voice revealed the deeper wounds that lay beneath his anger. The loss of Aaron, the fear of losing another son to the outside world. "Pa," Levi started, but Eli cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough. I've watched this foolishness long enough. Aaron knew how to handle horses properly. He wouldn't have wasted time with these gentle methods." The mention of Aaron's name hung heavy in the air like storm clouds threatening to burst. Clint studied Eli carefully, seeing beyond the anger to the grief that fueled it. "Your son Aaron must have been quite the horseman," he said quietly, watching as Eli's expression flickered between pride and pain. "But Levi here has a gift of his own. Different, perhaps, but no less valuable." Justice chose that moment to nuzzle Levi's shoulder, seeking reassurance. The simple gesture spoke volumes about the trust that had developed between boy and horse. Mary, still watching from her window, pressed her hand against the glass, silently willing her husband to see what was right before his eyes. "You bring your modern ideas here, turning my son's head with stories of the outside world," Eli continued, but his voice had lost some of its earlier fury. "We have survived for generations without such interference." "Survival isn't the same as living," Clint responded, his words carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Your son isn't rejecting your ways, Mr. Zook. He's finding his own path to honor them." The tension crackled between the three men, while Justice shifted restlessly, picking up on the undercurrents of emotion. Would Eli's fury drive an irreparable wedge between father and son? Could an aging Hollywood legend help bridge the gap between tradition and change? The answers lay balanced on a knife's edge, as delicate as the morning dew that still sparkled on the grass around them. Mary finally stepped away from her window, knowing it was time to add her own quiet wisdom to the volatile mixture in the pasture. But would her intervention come too late to prevent the growing rift in her family? The sound of her footsteps crossing the kitchen floor echoed with the weight of generations of mothers who had walked this same path, trying to keep their families whole in the face of change. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Zook farmyard as Eli confronted Levi near the barn. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted, their voices carrying across the previously peaceful homestead. Clint watched from the workshop doorway, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame as he witnessed the painful exchange between father and son. "You're throwing away everything we've built, everything our family stands for." Eli's words cut through the air. "Just like you threw away your brother's memory by letting that outsider handle justice." Levi's face flushed with anger and hurt. "Aaron's memory? Is that what this is about? You've been holding on to him so tight that you can't even see me standing right here." The mention of Aaron's name hung heavy in the air between them. Mary appeared on the porch, her hands clutched together in worry as she watched her husband and youngest son tear into wounds that had never properly healed. "What would you know about holding on?" Eli shot back. "You're so quick to abandon our ways to follow this Englisher around like a lost puppy." Aaron understood duty, understood what it meant to be part of this family. Clint felt his jaw tighten, recognizing in Eli's words the same rigid expectations he'd once placed on his own children. How many relationships had been damaged by fathers who couldn't see past their own pain? "Aaron's gone, Dat." Levi's voice cracked with emotion. "He's gone and I'm still here trying to live up to a ghost. Every time you look at me, I see disappointment because I'm not him. I never will be." The words seemed to physically strike Eli, causing him to step back. Mary moved forward, but stopped short of intervening, understanding that some storms needed to run their course. You think I don't know that? Eli's voice dropped dangerously low. You think I don't see it every day? Your brother knew his place, accepted his responsibilities, but you're too busy chasing English notions with that Hollywood actor. Clint stepped forward then, unable to remain silent. Mr. Zook, sometimes the hardest thing for a father to do is to see his son as his own person, not as a reflection of his own hopes or another's shadow. Eli whirled on Clint, his face flushed with anger. You have no right to speak of my sons or my family. You're nothing but a distraction, pulling Levi away from who he's meant to be. Who I'm meant to be? Levi's quiet question cut through the tension. Or who you need me to be? Because I don't think even you know anymore, Dad. Mary finally moved from the porch, her presence like a calm in the storm. Eli, these words, they're like arrows. Once released, they cannot be taken back. The truth of her statement seemed to penetrate Eli's anger. He looked between his wife and son, seeing perhaps for the first time the damage his grief had wrought on his family. You want to know who I am? Levi continued, his voice stronger now. I'm someone who loves this land, this life, but I'm also someone who needs to find his own way, just like Aaron did. He didn't follow blindly. He chose this life because it was right for him. Why can't you let me do the same? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Clint watched as Eli struggled with emotions he seemed ill-equipped to handle. How many fathers and sons had stood exactly where they stood now, separated by walls built of expectations and unspoken pain? Justice nickered from his stall, drawing everyone's attention. The horse that had once belonged to Aaron now stood as a living reminder of both what they had lost and what they might still save. Perhaps, Mary said softly, it's time we all stopped looking for Aaron in places he no longer exists, and started seeing what, and who, remains. Her words seemed to deflate the tension, leaving in its wake an exhausted silence filled with truths too long unspoken. But would these revelations lead to healing? Or would they only deepen the rifts that threatened to tear this family apart? The morning after the explosive argument hung heavy over the Zook farm, each family member moving through their duties like ghosts haunting familiar spaces. The silence spoke volumes, carrying the weight of words that could not be taken back and truths that had finally surfaced after years of careful burial. Levi found himself in the barn before dawn, methodically working through his chores while trying to quiet the echo of his father's accusations. Justice watched him from his stall, dark eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed to transcend species. The horse's presence offered a strange comfort, another being who knew what it meant to carry the burden of expectations. Who else could understand the pressure of trying to fill the void left by Aaron? Across the property, Clint observed the family's morning routine from his guesthouse window, noting how they avoided each other's paths with practiced precision. His years in Hollywood had taught him to read people, to understand the subtle language of avoidance and pain. The Zooks moved like actors in a well-choreographed dance of discord, each step carefully measured to maintain maximum distance. Mary's attempts to bridge the divide manifested in small gestures: fresh bread left on the kitchen table, clean shirts placed outside bedroom doors, a pot of coffee brewing before anyone asked. Her quiet ministry of love spoke into the silence, though her usual warm presence seemed diminished by the weight of witnessing her family's pain laid bare. Eli had retreated to his workshop, the rhythmic sound of his woodworking tools providing a counterpoint to the oppressive quiet. Each strike of his hammer seemed to punctuate the words he wished he could take back, while every cut of his saw marked another line drawn between himself and his surviving son. How had he allowed Aaron's death to create such a chasm? The tension finally broke mid-morning when Clint made his way to the barn, finding Levi struggling with Justice's training. The horse sensed the young man's distraction, responding with nervous energy that threatened to spiral out of control. Without a word, Clint stepped in, his presence alone helping to calm both horse and handler. Your father's words, Clint began, his voice gravelly but gentle. They're not really about you, son. He kept his eyes on Justice as he spoke, giving Levi the space to process without the pressure of direct confrontation. When grief gets stuck, it comes out sideways, turns into anger, expectations, disappointment, anything but what it really is. The wisdom of age and experience colored Clint's words as he continued working with the horse, demonstrating the patient persistence needed to build trust. I've seen it in Hollywood and families and myself. We get so caught up in who we think people should be that we forget to see who they are. Levi's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted Justice's lead rope. But how do you move forward when every step feels like a betrayal? To Aaron's memory, to my father's wishes, to everything I'm supposed to be? The question hung in the air as Mary appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. Her presence added another layer to the conversation, her silent strength offering support to both men. She began sorting through the vegetables, her actions providing a comfortable backdrop for the difficult discussion. Perhaps, she offered softly, moving forward isn't about betrayal at all. Maybe it's about finding a way to carry the past while still walking your own path. Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent years watching her family struggle with this very challenge. The conversation was interrupted by Justice suddenly pulling against his lead rope, his nervous energy building again. Clint stepped forward, demonstrating a technique for calming the horse that required both strength and gentleness. The parallel to their current situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Sometimes, Clint continued, his hands steady on the rope, the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Your father's struggling with that same battle, Levi. He's fighting against the idea that moving forward means leaving Aaron behind. Mary's quiet presence added another dimension to the conversation as she worked. Her actions a reminder that life continued even in the midst of emotional upheaval. The morning sun filtered through the barn windows, casting long shadows that seemed to connect the three people and the horse in a tableau of healing and hurt. How could they bridge the gap between honoring Aaron's memory and allowing themselves to grow beyond their grief? The question remained unspoken but present, as tangible as the morning light streaming through the barn's weathered boards. The path forward wasn't clear, but in that moment, surrounded by the quiet understanding of those present, it felt possible to at least take the first step. The morning dew clung heavy to the grass as Levi made his way to the barn, his footsteps careful and measured. The previous day's confrontation with his father still weighed on his mind, but something else occupied his thoughts, the subtle shift he'd noticed in Justice's behavior during their last interaction. The horse had shown a flicker of trust, a momentary lowering of defenses that gave Levi hope. Clint watched from the farmhouse porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Mary had insisted he stay for breakfast, and the old actor found himself unable to refuse her quiet hospitality. His eyes followed Levi's determined stride, recognizing in the young man's gait a newfound confidence that hadn't been there weeks ago. Inside the barn, Justice's ears pricked forward at Levi's approach, a marked difference from the usual pinned-back aggression. The horse's nostrils flared, taking in Levi's scent, but the typical anxious dancing was notably absent. Levi remembered Clint's words about patience and presence, about letting the horse come to terms with its own grief. How many times had Aaron stood in this very spot, sharing quiet moments with Justice before dawn? Mary appeared beside Clint on the porch, her presence as gentle as the morning itself. "He reminds me of Aaron sometimes," she said softly, watching her younger son. "Not in his ways, but in his heart." The observation hung between them, heavy, with meaning. Clint nodded, understanding the complex layers of loss and hope woven into her words. In the barn, Levi began his new routine, one built on Clint's guidance and his own growing intuition. Instead of immediately reaching for tack or tools, he simply stood near Justice's stall, speaking in low, steady tones about nothing in particular. The horse's dark eyes tracked his movements, but the usual fear was tempered by curiosity. Eli emerged from the house, pausing briefly at the sight of his wife and Clint sharing the morning vigil. His jaw tightened, but Mary's presence kept his disapproval in check. He watched as Levi opened the stall door, expecting the usual chaos. Instead, Justice remained still, head lowered slightly, in what could only be described as consideration. The breakthrough came without fanfare or dramatic gesture. As Levi extended his hand, palm up and empty, Justice took a tentative step forward. The moment stretched like honey in sunlight, sweet, golden, and somehow both fragile and eternal. When the horse's soft muzzle finally met Levi's palm, the contact sent ripples of understanding through both beings. Clint felt his throat tighten at the scene. He'd seen this moment before, in different contexts with different souls, but its power never diminished. Mary's quiet intake of breath suggested she too recognized the significance. Even Eli, despite his stubborn resistance to change, couldn't deny the transformation unfolding before them. Justice's acceptance of Levi marked more than just progress in horse training. It represented a crack in the wall of grief that had surrounded the Zook family since Aaron's death. The horse, who had carried their collective pain and his wild fear, was beginning to heal. And in his healing, he offered a path forward for them all. As the morning light strengthened, Levi began the careful work of grooming Justice. Each stroke of the brush seemed to dissolve another layer of tension from the horse's muscles. The animal's eyes, once wild with remembered trauma, now held a glimmer of peace. Clint recognized the therapeutic rhythm of the interaction. How it soothed not just the horse but the young man as well. Mary slipped away to prepare breakfast, leaving Clint and Eli in an uncomfortable silence. The two men, separated by culture and worldview, found themselves united in their observation of Levi's quiet victory. Perhaps it was this shared witness that prompted Eli to speak, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Aaron always said that horse had something special in him. The acknowledgement, however small, opened a door. Clint's response was carefully measured, respecting both the progress and the pain still present. Sometimes it takes special circumstances to bring out what's always been there. They both knew he wasn't just talking about the horse. Inside the barn, unaware of the conversation outside, Levi continued his gentle work with Justice. The horse's transformation mirrored his own, both of them learning to trust again, to move beyond the shadows of expectations and loss. With each passing moment, the bond between them strengthened, built on something deeper than command or control. What would Aaron think of this moment? The question floated through the minds of all present, though none voiced it aloud. Perhaps he would recognize that while grief had initially broken them apart, it was now, paradoxically, helping to bring them together in unexpected ways. The autumn evening cast long shadows across the Zook's farmhouse, as Mary kneaded dough in the kitchen, her methodical movements a meditation that had carried her through countless difficult days. The unexpected sound of boots on the porch drew her attention, and she turned to find Clint Eastwood standing in the doorway, his weathered face bearing an expression she hadn't seen before. "Mrs. Zook," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been carrying thoughts too heavy to bear alone. "Mind if I join you for a spell?" Mary gestured to the wooden chair at the kitchen table, noting how the legendary actor seemed smaller somehow, more human than the larger-than-life figure who had first arrived at their farm. As she continued her work, the comfortable silence between them spoke of a shared understanding of grief's language. "Your boy reminds me of someone," Clint finally said, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "My son Kyle, when he was younger, had that same fire in his eyes, that same need to prove himself." He paused, gathering thoughts that seemed to pain him. "Lost him 5 years ago. Cancer, didn't even get to say goodbye properly." Mary's hands stilled in the dough, but she remained quiet, understanding that some stories needed space to unfold. Clint continued, his voice growing softer as he spoke of Kyle's passion for music, his dreams of becoming a composer, and the way illness had stolen those dreams piece by piece. "Watching Levi with Justice, it brings it all back," Clint admitted. The way Kyle would throw himself into his music, how he'd work at a piece until his fingers bled. That kind of dedication, it's rare. Your boy has it too. Mary wiped her hands on her apron, finally taking a seat across from Clint. "We see Aaron in him too," she said softly. "Perhaps that's why Eli struggles so. The resemblance is sometimes too much to bear. The conversation shifted to Aaron, and Mary found herself sharing details she hadn't spoken aloud since his passing. His gentle way with animals, his quiet strength, the morning they found him in the barn after the accident. Clint listened with the patience of someone who understood that healing often began with speaking the unspeakable. You know, Mrs. Zook, I've played tough guys my whole life. Clint reflected, a hint of irony in his voice. Made a career out of being the man who never breaks, but losing a child, it breaks something in you that no amount of pretending can fix. Mary nodded, understanding flowing between them like an invisible current. Perhaps that's why you were led here, she suggested. Not just for Levi, but for all of us, even you. Their conversation turned to Justice, the horse that had become a living embodiment of their shared grief. Mary spoke of how the animal had changed after Aaron's death, becoming as unreachable as Eli had in his sorrow. But now, with Levi's gentle persistence and Clint's guidance, something was shifting. I've seen how you work with them both, Levi and Justice, Mary observed. You understand that healing can't be forced, it must be invited. Clint's eyes met hers, recognition flickering in their depths. Your son Aaron, he knew that too, didn't he? About horses, about people? Mary's smile held both sadness and pride. Yes, he did. And now Levi is learning the same lesson, though perhaps in his own way. As the evening deepened around them, their conversation continued, touching on memories both painful and precious. Mary shared stories of Aaron's childhood, of Levi's struggles to find his place, of Eli's battles with his own rigid nature. Clint spoke of his own regrets, of moments missed with Kyle, of the wisdom that came too late. In the quiet of the kitchen, as the last light faded from the windows, something shifted between them, an understanding that transcended their different worlds. They were no longer simply an Amish mother and a Hollywood legend, but two people who understood the complex geometry of loss and the slow, painful work of healing. The sound of hoofbeats from the paddock drew their attention, and they moved to the window to watch Levi working with Justice in the gathering dusk. The horse moved with growing confidence, responding to Levi's quiet commands with increasing trust. In that moment, watching the young man and the horse move together in the fading light, both Mary and Clint saw something that gave them hope. The possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal, given time, patience, and the courage to remain open to unexpected grace. The morning dew clung heavy to the grass as Eli Zook made his way across the farmyard, his weathered hands gripping a set of leather reins. The familiar weight felt different today, carrying the burden of words left unsaid between father and son. Through the barn's wide doorway, he could see Levi already at work, methodically cleaning Justice's stall while the horse watched with wary eyes from the paddock. Eli paused, studying his youngest son's movements, so different from Aaron's confident stride, yet carrying their own kind of strength. When had he stopped seeing Levi for who he was, rather than who he wasn't? The question gnawed at him as he remembered Mary's gentle but firm words from the night before about giving their surviving son room to find his own path. Inside the barn, Levi tensed at his father's approaching footsteps but continued his work, the steady scrape of the pitchfork against wooden planks filling the silence between them. The morning light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the distance between father and son. The English. Clint, he's been helping you with Justice? Eli's voice carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. The question hung in the air, more complex than its simple words suggested. Was it an accusation or an olive branch? Levi straightened slowly, choosing his words with care. Yeah, he has knowledge about horses. Different from ours, but there's wisdom in it. He waited for his father's familiar disapproval, but it didn't come. Instead, Eli moved closer to Justice's stall, his eyes fixed on the nervous horse. Your mother tells me he lost someone too, a daughter. The admission seemed to cost him something, acknowledging a connection with the outsider who had inadvertently become entangled in their family's healing. He understands grief, Levi replied, softly, thinking of the quiet conversations shared while working with Justice. Like we do. The words carried the weight of Aaron's absence, ever present yet rarely acknowledged between them. Eli's hands worked the leather reins absently, a habit born of decades handling horses. "Show me," he said finally, the request catching Levi off guard. "Show me what he's taught you about justice." The moment stretched between them, fragile as a spider's web. Levi nodded slowly, setting aside the pitchfork and moving toward the paddock where Justice stood. As he demonstrated the gentle approach Clint had shown him, Eli watched with an intensity that spoke of more than just interest in horse training. Aaron would have liked these methods, Eli admitted quietly, surprising them both. It was the first time he had spoken of Aaron without pain clouding his voice. He always said there was more than one way to train a horse. The observation opened something in Levi's chest, not healing exactly, but the possibility of it. "I remember," he said, thinking of summer evenings spent watching his brother work with young colts. "He taught me to listen to what the horse was trying to tell us." As if in response to their shared memory, Justice nickered softly and took a tentative step toward them. The horse's progress mirrored their own, small steps forward, careful and uncertain, but movement nonetheless. "Your mother says the English, Clint, he's planning to stay through the harvest?" Eli's question carried less judgment than it might have days ago. The subtle shift didn't go unnoticed by Levi, who recognized the effort behind it. "If the community allows it," Levi answered carefully. "He's been helpful with more than just justice." The unspoken question lingered. Would his father oppose or support Clint's continued presence? Eli studied the horizon where the morning sun was burning away the last of the mist. "Perhaps," he began, then paused to find the right words. "Perhaps there are things we can learn from each other." The admission cost him pride, but Mary's influence had begun to soften his rigid certainties. They worked together in the barn that morning, not filling the silence with words but allowing it to exist without the weight of disappointment it usually carried. Small steps, Levi thought, remembering Clint's advice about patience, with horses and with healing. As they finished the morning chores, Eli reached out and briefly touched Levi's shoulder, a gesture so unexpected it nearly caused him to drop the water bucket he was carrying. "Your brother's death," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "It changed more than just justice. It changed us all." The acknowledgement, simple as it was, opened a door that had long been sealed between them. What would walk through it remained to be seen, but for now the possibility was enough. Like Justice's slow progress toward trust, their relationship would need time and patience to find its new shape. The autumn morning carried a crisp bite as Levi Zook made his way to the barn, his footsteps crunching against fallen leaves. For weeks now, he and Clint had worked tirelessly with Justice, and though the horse showed improvement, something still held him back, much like the invisible barrier that remained between Levi and his father. Clint was already there, his weathered hands running along Justice's flank with the gentleness that had surprised Levi when they first met. Who would have thought that the man known for his tough guy roles would possess such patience? The horse's ears twitched at Levi's approach, but he didn't shy away as he once would have. "Your mother tells me you used to help Aaron train the younger horses," Clint said without turning around, his voice carrying the gravelly wisdom that had become familiar to Levi over these past months. The mention of Aaron's name no longer caused the sharp pain it once did, though the ache remained. "Ja, but I was never as good as him," Levi replied, stepping closer to Justice. The horse's dark eyes watched him, holding something that seemed like recognition. How many times had those same eyes looked at Aaron with trust and affection? From the house, Mary Zook observed through the kitchen window while kneading bread dough, her hands working with practiced efficiency as she watched her youngest son with the Hollywood legend who had somehow become part of their world. She noticed Eli pause in his work at the woodpile, his attention drawn to the scene unfolding at the barn. Justice suddenly stepped sideways, but instead of the nervous dance that had become his habit since Aaron's death, this movement carried purpose. The horse moved directly toward Levi, dropping his head to bump gently against the young man's chest. The gesture, so simple yet profound, caused Levi's breath to catch in his throat. "Well," "Would you look at that?" Clint murmured, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Seems like someone's finally ready to let go of the past." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, and Levi understood they weren't just talking about justice anymore. The horse continued to press against Levi, and for the first time since Aaron's death, Levi felt the warmth of complete acceptance from his brother's beloved companion. His hands found their way to Justice's neck, fingers threading through the coarse mane. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in closer. From his position by the woodpile, Eli watched his son with the horse that had once been so devoted to Aaron. Something shifted in his chest, a loosening of the tight grip grief had maintained on his heart. He saw not just Levi standing there, but echoes of Aaron too, in the way Levi's hands moved with confidence, in the slight tilt of his head as he spoke softly to Justice. Clint stepped back, creating space for this moment of connection. He'd seen enough breakthroughs in his long life to recognize the significance of what was happening. Justice wasn't just accepting Levi, he was choosing him, acknowledging him as his new partner in a way that felt like a blessing from beyond. Mary appeared at the barn entrance, drawn by the energy of the moment. Her eyes met Clint's, and a silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't just about a horse accepting a new rider. It was about a family learning to embrace change while honoring memory. Justice lifted his head, turning to nuzzle Levi's pocket where he knew treats were often kept. The gesture was so normal, so reminiscent of how he used to behave with Aaron, that it brought tears to Levi's eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of acceptance, of moving forward while carrying the past gently with them. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across the barn floor. In this moment of connection, something profound was happening, not just between horse and human, but within the fabric of the Zook family itself. Justice's gift of trust was more than just acceptance of Levi. It was permission for all of them to move forward, to find new ways of being while honoring what had been lost. What would Aaron think if he could see them now? Perhaps he already knew, his spirit present in the gentle morning air, in Justice's trust in the way his family was slowly learning to live with his absence while celebrating the love that remained. How many more moments of healing lay ahead for this unlikely gathering of souls? The harvest moon cast long shadows across the Lancaster County farmland as Clint Eastwood sat alone on the Zook's front porch, the familiar creak of the rocking chair accompanying his thoughts. At 93, he'd lived enough lives for several men, yet somehow this quiet Pennsylvania farm had shown him sides of himself he never knew existed. Earlier that day, he'd witnessed something remarkable. Levi and Justice moving as one, their connection transcending the painful memories that had haunted both horse and rider. The transformation reminded him of his own journey in filmmaking, how the most powerful scenes often emerged from the rawness of real emotion, rather than carefully scripted moments. What had drawn him to stay here, far from the California comfort he'd known for decades? Perhaps it was the way Mary Zook's quiet wisdom reminded him of his own mother, or how Eli's stubborn pride mirrored his younger self. But mostly it was Levi, a young man standing at the crossroads of tradition and personal truth, much like characters he'd portrayed throughout his career. The night air carried the distant sound of horses in the barn, and Clint's thoughts drifted to his first weeks here. How many Hollywood directors could say they'd learned to milk cows at 93? The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the humility of those moments had stripped away layers of pretense he hadn't realized he still carried. He thought of the conversations with Mary over coffee at dawn, her gentle insights about grief and healing wrapped in simple observations about daily life. She'd seen through his gruff exterior from the start, recognizing a fellow soul who understood the weight of watching loved ones struggle. What would she make of the changes he'd observed in her family? Eli's transformation had been subtle but significant. The stern patriarch still maintained his distance, but Clint had caught him watching Levi with Justice, pride briefly replacing the perpetual worry in his eyes. How much of Eli's rigid exterior was truly about preserving tradition, and how much was fear of losing another son to the outside world? The screen door creaked, and Clint sensed rather than saw Mary's presence. She placed a cup of tea beside him without speaking, understanding his need for solitude. The gesture reminded him of countless film sets where the most powerful moments happened between the lines, in the unspoken understanding between actors. What would Aaron think of the changes in his family? The question had haunted Clint since learning the young man's story. Death had a way of freezing people in time, their potential forever locked in what might have beens. But perhaps Aaron's legacy lived on in the way his passing had ultimately brought healing, albeit through unexpected channels. The night deepened, and Clint considered his own role in this unfolding drama. He'd come to Lancaster County seeking escape from the hollow congratulations and lifetime achievement awards that marked the sunset of his career. Instead, he'd found himself cast in perhaps his most challenging role, not as an actor or director, but as a catalyst for change in lives that would have seemed alien to him mere months ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Levi's growing confidence with justice would inevitably lead to questions about his future. Eli would face decisions about loosening his grip on tradition. Mary would continue her quiet work of keeping the family's heart beating. And Clint? What was his final act in this story? The moon climbed higher, and with it rose questions about his own journey. Had he come here to teach or to learn? To heal or be healed? The lines had blurred somewhere between the first morning prayers and tonight's triumph with justice. Perhaps that was the greatest gift this family had given him, the understanding that even at 93, life could still surprise you with its capacity for growth and connection. A cool breeze carried the scent of approaching autumn, and with it, a sense of both ending and beginning. What would the harvest bring for this unlikely gathering of souls? The answer lay somewhere between the rows of corn and the stars above, in the space where Hollywood legend met Amish simplicity, and in the mysterious ways grief could transform into unexpected grace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Zook farmhouse as Clint sat at the weathered kitchen table, pen hovering over crisp white paper. How could mere words capture the transformative months he'd spent with this remarkable family? The weight of what he needed to express pressed heavily on his shoulders as he began to write. Dear Levi. The letter flowed from his pen, carrying with it the wisdom of his 90-plus years and the deep affection he'd developed for the young Amish man who had unknowingly helped heal his own wounds. Clint detailed his observations of Levi's natural talent with horses, his intuitive understanding of their psychology, and his unique ability to connect with even the most troubled animals. He wrote of watching Levi work with justice, seeing not just a young man training a horse but a soul finding its true purpose. As his pen moved across the page, Clint included a proposition that had been forming in his mind for weeks. He owned a small horse ranch in California, currently managed by trusted hands but lacking someone with the perfect combination of skill and heart. The offer was clear, a chance for Levi to apprentice there, to learn modern horse training techniques while maintaining his values, to build a bridge between his Amish heritage and a wider world of possibilities. Mary Zook quietly entered the kitchen, placing a steaming cup of coffee beside Clint without disturbing his concentration. She lingered for a moment, her presence carrying the same gentle understanding that had helped facilitate the unlikely friendship between the Hollywood legend and her son. Clint looked up briefly, catching her knowing smile. She had sensed his intentions long before he had put them to paper. The letter addressed the complex dynamics at play, acknowledging Eli's legitimate concerns while advocating for Levi's unique path. Clint wrote of his own journey, of how sometimes the most meaningful life isn't the one carefully planned, but the one that unfolds through following one's true calling. He included practical details about the ranch, the living arrangements, and the potential for Levi to eventually establish his own horse training program. In a separate envelope, Clint penned a letter to Eli and Mary, expressing his profound gratitude for their hospitality and the privilege of becoming part of their family's story. He wrote of seeing in Levi echoes of his deceased brother Aaron's spirit, not as a replacement, but as a continuation of the family's legacy of working with horses, albeit in an unexpected direction. The decision to leave these letters behind, rather than delivering them in person had been difficult. Yet Clint understood that such life-altering choices required space for reflection, free from the pressure of immediate response. The family needed time to process the proposition, to weigh tradition against potential, to find their own path toward reconciliation with change. Clint sealed both envelopes, his weathered hands smoothing over the paper one final time. He placed them in the center of the table, where the morning light illuminated them like a beacon of possibility. The simple white envelopes held within them seeds of transformation, not just for Levi, but for the entire family. Would they take root in the fertile soil of love and understanding that had grown between them all? Rising from the table, Clint gazed out the kitchen window at Justice grazing peacefully in the morning mist. The horse had come so far from the troubled animal that had first drawn him into the Zook's world. In helping to heal Justice, they had all found healing themselves. Now, perhaps these letters would open the door to the next chapter in their intertwined stories. Mary returned to the kitchen, this time with Clint's packed bags. No words were necessary between them. She understood the timing of his departure as she understood so many things. The letters would speak what needed to be said, and the future would unfold as it should. But what changes would these simple envelopes bring to the quiet rhythm of Amish life? How would Eli react to this unexpected proposition for his son's future? And most importantly, would Levi find the courage to embrace a path that diverged from generations of tradition while remaining true to the core values that defined him? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Zook family's barn as Levi stood before Justice's stall, clutching Clint's letter in his trembling hands. The weight of its contents, an offer to apprentice at Clint's ranch in California, pressed heavily on his heart. How could he even consider such an opportunity when generations of Zook men had worked this very land? The sound of steady footsteps drew Levi's attention. His father, Eli, appeared in the barn doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dawn light. The sight of his father sent Levi's pulse racing. Would this be another confrontation about duty and tradition? "Your mother told me about the letter," Eli said, his voice uncharacteristically soft as he approached. The usual sternness in his features had softened, replaced by something Levi hadn't seen since before Aaron's death: vulnerability. Levi's fingers tightened around the paper. "I haven't decided anything yet," he began, but Eli raised his hand, silencing him. "When Aaron died," Eli continued, "I thought I knew exactly how to protect this family. Keep everything the same. Hold tight to our ways." He reached out to stroke Justice's nose, the horse nickering softly at his touch. "But watching you with Clint, seeing how you've helped Justice heal, it's shown me something I've been too stubborn to see." Mary appeared in the doorway, her quiet presence lending strength to this delicate moment between father and son. She remained silent, but her eyes held understanding and encouragement. "The English world isn't what I feared," Eli admitted, turning to face his son fully. "Clint Eastwood may not share our faith, but he has shown me that wisdom and goodness can come from unexpected places. He has helped heal not just Justice, but our family too." Levi felt tears threatening to spill. "But the farm, our way of life. Your brother Aaron loved this life with his whole heart," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you, Levi, you have always seen things differently, like your mother does. Perhaps that is God's gift to you, not a fault to be corrected." Mary stepped forward then, placing a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Tell him, Eli," she urged softly. Eli drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a momentous task. "Last night I wrote to Bishop Stoltzfus. I asked him to consider a special dispensation, one that would allow you to learn from Clint while maintaining your connection to our community." The implications of this request stunned Levi into silence. Such arrangements were rare, requiring careful consideration and strict guidelines. That his father would even suggest it spoke volumes about how far he'd come. "I cannot promise the bishop will agree," Eli continued, "but whether he does or not, I want you to know this. You have my blessing to follow the path God has set before you, even if it leads away from here." Justice whinnied softly, as if adding his own approval to Eli's words. The horse that had once been so broken by grief now stood tall and proud, a living testament to the healing power of change and acceptance. "The world is changing," Mary added, her wise eyes meeting Levi's. "Perhaps God is showing us that there are many ways to honor Him and our traditions. Your father and I have learned this through you and through Clint." Eli stepped forward, placing his weathered hands on Levi's shoulders. "Your brother's death taught me that holding too tightly to what we love can sometimes break it. I won't make that mistake with you, son." The morning light strengthened, filling the barn with golden warmth as father and son embraced. Mary joined them, completing the circle of family love and acceptance. Outside, the familiar sounds of their Amish community beginning its day mingled with the modern world beyond, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful traditions are those that bend rather than break. As they stood together in that moment of understanding, Levi realized that his father's blessing had given him something far more precious than permission to leave. It had given him the freedom to become who he was meant to be while keeping his heart anchored in the love of family and faith. But what challenges would this new path bring? How would the community react to this unprecedented arrangement? And how would Levi navigate the delicate balance between two very different worlds? The early morning mist clung to the Zook farmland as Levi methodically packed his modest belongings into a worn leather satchel. Each item carried weight beyond its physical presence. His father's old woodworking tools, carefully wrapped sketches of furniture designs, and a small photo of Aaron tucked between the pages of his Bible. How strange it felt to prepare for a journey that would take him beyond the boundaries of everything he'd known. In the stable, Clint watched Justice nuzzle against Levi's shoulder while the young man secured the saddle. The horse had transformed from a skittish, unpredictable creature into a steady companion, a living testament to patience and understanding. The old actor recognized something of himself in the animal's journey, remembering how his own walls had crumbled in the presence of this remarkable Amish family. "You know, kid," Clint's gravelly voice broke the morning silence. "Sometimes the hardest part of following your path is taking that first step away from home." His weathered hands absently stroked Justice's mane as he spoke. The month spent working with Levi had awakened something in him that he'd thought long dormant, a desire to pass on not just knowledge, but wisdom earned through years of forging, his own way. Mary appeared in the stable doorway, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The aroma of fresh-baked bread and apple butter filled the space, mixing with the earthy scent of hay and leather. She'd spent the previous evening preparing food for Levi's journey, each recipe carrying unspoken messages of love and support. Her quiet strength had been instrumental in bringing healing to their family, though she would never claim credit for it. Inside the house, Eli stood at his workbench, running calloused fingers over the smooth surface of a half-finished rocking chair. The project had begun as a way to keep his hands busy during sleepless nights but had evolved into something more, a physical representation of his changing relationship with his younger son. Would Levi understand the message carved into its arms? The intricate pattern spoke of growth, change, and the endless cycle of seasons that brought both loss and renewal. Clint observed the family's preparations with a mixture of pride and melancholy. How different things were from when he'd first arrived, seeking solitude and finding instead a chance at redemption. The Zooks had become more than subjects for his documentary. They had become family. Their struggle with grief had mirrored his own, and through helping them heal, he'd found his own peace. Mary approached her son with the basket, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The world outside will be different, Levi," she said softly. "But remember that your heart knows the way home." Her words carried the weight of generations of mothers who had watched their children venture into the unknown, carrying hope and fear in equal measure. Eli emerged from his workshop, holding something wrapped in soft cloth. The morning light caught the silver in his beard as he handed the package to Levi. Inside lay a beautifully crafted set of specialized woodworking tools, each handle bearing the distinctive mark of Zook craftsmanship. The gift represented more than just practical support. It was a tangible blessing, an acknowledgement that different paths could still lead to truth. Justice stamped impatiently, sensing the energy of impending departure. The horse had become a bridge between two worlds, the traditional life Levi was leaving and the new path he was embracing. Would this journey help him find the balance between honoring his heritage and following his heart? Could he carry forward the lessons learned from both his father's stubborn strength and Clint's unconventional wisdom? As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the barnyard, the time for departure drew near. Clint found himself remembering other goodbyes, other moments of transition that had shaped his life. What would become of this unlikely family that had welcomed him into their midst? How would their story continue to unfold once he and Levi departed for the apprenticeship program? The morning air filled with the sound of horse hooves on packed earth, wagon wheels turning, and the quiet murmur of family voices sharing final words of advice and affection. Change hung in the air like morning mist, promising both challenge and opportunity. As Levi mounted Justice and Clint climbed into his truck, both men carried with them the understanding that endings often disguise themselves as beginnings, and that the horizon ahead held possibilities neither could yet imagine. The autumn wind whispered through the Zook farm as Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the property, his weathered hands resting on the wooden fence. His eyes traced the familiar path where he'd first driven up months ago, a stranger in a strange land. Now, watching Mary Zook hang laundry in the distance while Eli worked in the barn, he felt an unexpected ache in his chest. How had these simple people managed to carve such a deep space in his heart? The sound of hooves drew his attention as Levi approached on Justice, the horse's gait steady and confident, a far cry from the nervous creature they'd first encountered. Justice's transformation mirrored their own, each of them changed by the months they'd spent together. The young man dismounted with an ease that spoke of his growing confidence, though his eyes held a hint of sadness as he approached his mentor. "The English world will be different from anything you've known," Clint said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But you've got something many don't. You know who you are." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Levi's decision to pursue his apprenticeship had initially created tension, but the family had found their way to acceptance through countless small moments of understanding. Mary approached them, wiping her hands on her apron. She carried herself with the quiet dignity that had helped hold the family together through their darkest days. "The bread is ready," she announced, but her words meant more than a simple invitation to eat. They were an offering of love, of family, of belonging that transcended their different worlds. Inside the kitchen, Eli joined them, his stern facade softened by months of gradual change. The man who had once viewed Clint with suspicion now pulled out a chair for him with genuine warmth. The transformation hadn't come easily. It had been built on shared work, quiet conversations, and the slow healing of wounds left by Aaron's death. "Remember what we discussed about Justice?" Clint asked Levi as Mary served the fresh bread. The question wasn't really about the horse, but about the deeper lessons they'd learned together. Levi nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaborate explanation. They'd spent countless hours working with the horse, each session revealing as much about themselves as about the animal they were training. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on practical matters of Levi's upcoming departure while skirting the emotions that ran beneath the surface. Mary's quiet wisdom emerged in gentle suggestions about what to pack, while Eli offered unexpected advice about maintaining one's principles in a different world. The family had found a new balance, their love for each other stronger for having been tested. As the afternoon light began to fade, Clint knew it was time. He'd stayed longer than he'd initially planned, drawn in by this family's journey and his own unexpected healing. The grief he'd carried for so long had softened in the presence of their authentic living and genuine struggles. In helping Levi find his path, Clint had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were lost to time. Standing in the barnyard, the family gathered for final farewells. Justice nickered softly from his stall as if adding his own goodbye. The horse that had once been a symbol of their collective grief now stood as a testament to their growth, Eli stepped forward first, extending his hand to Clint with a firm grip that conveyed respect and gratitude. The two men had moved beyond their initial mistrust to find common ground in their care for Levi and their understanding of loss. Mary's goodbye was characteristically gentle yet profound. She pressed a package into Clint's hands, bread for his journey but also a tangible reminder of the home he'd found here. Her eyes held knowing as she stepped back, understanding that some bonds don't require words to maintain their strength. Finally, Clint turned to Levi. The young man stood straighter now, his eyes clear and purposeful. Their relationship had evolved beyond mentor and student to something deeper, a connection forged through shared understanding and mutual respect. What could be said in such a moment? How does one acknowledge the ways lives intersect and change each other's courses? The sun was setting as Clint drove away, the Zook farm growing smaller in his rearview mirror. He carried with him more than memories. He had found healing in this unlikely place among people whose way of life was so different from his own, and perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that peace often comes in unexpected packages, and family can be found in the most surprising places. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Zook farm as Clint loaded the last of his belongings into his truck. His weathered hands lingered on the steering wheel, memories of the past months flooding his mind. Who could have predicted that a wrong turn down a Pennsylvania backroad would lead to such profound changes? Through the windshield, he watched, Levi leading Justice across the morning frosted pasture. The horse moved with a newfound grace, his nervous energy replaced by quiet confidence. Like Justice, Levi too carried himself differently now, shoulders straight, head high, no longer burdened by the weight of being the wrong son. Mary appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She carried a package wrapped in brown paper, approaching Clint's truck with measured steps. "For your journey," she said softly, passing him what he knew would be freshly baked bread. Their eyes met in silent understanding, no elaborate words needed between two people who recognized the healing power of quiet presence. The screen door creaked, and Eli emerged, his stern facade softened by something new, perhaps wisdom, perhaps acceptance. He crossed the yard to where Clint sat in his idling truck. How far they'd come from those first suspicious glances and terse exchanges. The older men regarded each other, years of life experience passing between them. "You've given us more than, you know," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion he'd only recently learned to express. "Not just with Justice, but," he glanced toward Levi, who was now walking toward them, his step sure and purposeful. Clint nodded, understanding the unspoken. Sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as challenges, like an unruly horse or a lost son. His own grief over his late wife had eased during his time here, replaced by something warmer. The knowledge that love could take many forms, that family wasn't always bound by blood. Levi reached the truck, Justice following without being led. The young man's eyes held a mixture of sadness and strength. "Will you visit?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Some chapters were meant to close gently, their impact felt rather than continued. "You know where to find me," Clint replied, his trademark half-smile playing at his lips. "Hollywood's not going anywhere." The joke landed softly, acknowledging the impossibility while honoring the connection they'd forged. Justice nickered softly, pressing his nose against the truck's window. How many hours had they spent working with this horse, each session revealing as much about themselves as about the animal? The creature's transformation mirrored their own, from broken to whole, from fearful to confident. Mary stepped forward, placing her hand on Levi's shoulder. The gesture spoke volumes about their family's evolution, touch and tenderness replacing distance and doubt. Eli moved closer to his wife and son, completing the picture of unity that had seemed impossible months ago. Clint turned the key, the engine's rumble breaking the morning quiet. As he put the truck in gear, he caught a final glimpse in his rearview mirror. The Zook family standing together, Justice's dark form beside them, all bathed in early light. The image would stay with him, a reminder that sometimes the greatest roles weren't played on any screen. The truck rolled forward, gravel crunching under its tires. Each turn of the wheels carried him further from the farm, but the lessons learned there would remain. How strange that in helping a family heal, he'd found his own peace. In teaching a young man to forge his own path, he'd rediscovered his. The main road appeared ahead, offering two directions, back to his familiar world of scripts and cameras or toward new unknown adventures. Either way, he was no longer the same man who'd accidentally discovered the Zook farm all those months ago. The road stretched before him, full of possibility, just as it now did for the family he left behind. What new chapters awaited them all? Only time would tell, but the foundations had been laid in these quiet months of transformation. Sometimes the most powerful changes came not from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from the simple act of showing up day after day and choosing to remain present in each other's lives. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.